If this house belongs to Jason, then why am I still paying the property taxes? The question cut through the room so sharply that every conversation stopped. Laughter faded. Glasses were lowered onto the dining table. Even the soft music playing in the background suddenly seemed distant. Margaret Bennett stood near the stone fireplace of the spacious family home, her silver hair catching the warm light from a chandelier overhead. Around her, friends and relatives gathered for what was supposed to be a joyful family celebration. Instead, the evening had taken a turn nobody expected. Across the room, Lauren Bennett stared at her mother-in-law with disbelief. Then she laughed. Not because she found the situation amusing, but because the statement sounded impossible to her. "You cannot be serious," Lauren said. Several people exchanged nervous glances. Jason Bennett, standing beside his wife, rubbed the back of his neck and looked uncomfortable. "Mom," he said carefully, "I think there is some confusion." Margaret did not respond immediately. Her expression remained calm. That calmness seemed to irritate Lauren even more. "Confusion?" Lauren repeated. "The paperwork is clear. Everyone here knows the house belongs to Jason now." A few family members nodded. Others remained silent. The house itself was impressive. It sat on nearly 2 acres of land in a desirable suburban neighborhood. The property had increased dramatically in value over the years. Large windows overlooked a beautifully maintained backyard. The kitchen featured custom cabinetry and high-end finishes. It was the kind of home people dreamed about owning. And tonight, ownership had suddenly become the center of attention. Margaret slowly looked around the room. These were people she had known for years. People who had celebrated holidays under this roof. People who had shared meals at this very table. Yet not one of them seemed willing to consider that she might be telling the truth. Lauren crossed her arms. "You told everyone this house still belongs to you." Her voice carried through the room. "Why would you say something like that?" The question hung in the air. Margaret met her gaze. "Because it is true." The response triggered another wave of disbelief. Jason sighed heavily. "Mom, I do not understand why you are doing this." The words hurt more than he realized. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. She remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle in the driveway. She remembered helping him move into his first apartment. She remembered every sacrifice that came with raising a child. Now he was looking at her as though she were a stranger. Lauren stepped forward. "Then explain it," she said. "Explain how everyone else is wrong." Margaret remained remarkably composed. "Not everyone has all the facts." Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. The statement sounded strange. Almost mysterious. Lauren shook her head. "There are no missing facts." She gestured toward the house around them. "Jason has handled everything for years." More nods. More agreement. The room was slowly turning against Margaret. Yet she did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply stood there with a quiet confidence that seemed completely out of place given the situation. That confidence only made people more skeptical. If she truly had evidence, why was she not presenting it? If she was right, why was she standing alone? Jason looked exhausted. "Mom, please. Let us not do this tonight." Margaret's eyes softened. "I did not start this conversation." The room fell silent again. Nobody knew how to respond. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Inside, tension continued to build. Lauren glanced around as though seeking support from everyone present. She found it almost immediately. Most people believed her. Most people believed Jason. And as the uncomfortable silence settled over the gathering, Margaret Bennett stood completely alone, surrounded by doubt, while a secret connected to the house waited quietly for the right moment to be revealed. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Nobody seemed eager to continue the celebration. The laughter that had filled the house less than an hour earlier was gone, replaced by uneasy glances and whispered assumptions. Margaret Bennet remained standing near the fireplace while the rest of the family slowly settled into positions around the living room and dining area. Yet even as people sat down, their attention never left her. Lauren appeared increasingly certain of herself. The more Margaret refused to explain, the more Lauren believed she had exposed a mistake. To her, the situation was simple. Property ownership was documented. Records existed. Houses did not belong to people based on feelings. They belonged to people based on paperwork. Jason seemed to agree. He walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the backyard and folded his arms. His expression carried frustration rather than anger. He genuinely believed there had been a misunderstanding. What troubled him was not his mother's claim. It was her refusal to back away from it. "Mom," he said again, trying to remain patient, "everyone here knows I have been managing the property for years." Margaret nodded. "That is true." Jason blinked. He had not expected agreement. Lauren immediately stepped in. "Then why are we even having this conversation?" Several relatives nodded. The question sounded reasonable. Margaret looked around the room before answering. Managing a property and owning a property are not the same thing. The statement triggered another wave of confusion. An uncle sitting near the dining table frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret hesitated. Not because she lacked an answer, but because she seemed unwilling to reveal it. "It means there are details you do not know." Lauren let out a quiet laugh. There it is again. More mysterious details. The sarcasm drew a few uncomfortable smiles from others in the room. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly one-sided. Every explanation Margaret offered sounded incomplete. Every response seemed to create more questions than answers. That worked against her. People naturally trusted certainty over ambiguity. Lauren sounded certain. Margaret did not. Across the room, Jason rubbed his forehead. He looked exhausted by the entire conversation. The house had become the center of attention for reasons he never imagined. He had spent years helping maintain it, coordinating repairs, paying bills, and handling responsibilities whenever his mother needed assistance. To him, ownership felt obvious. That belief made Margaret's insistence even harder to understand. A cousin sitting nearby leaned forward. "Margaret, are you saying everyone is wrong?" The question lingered in the room. Margaret considered it carefully. Then she shook her head. "No." Several people looked relieved. But then she added, "I am saying everyone is missing part of the story." The relief disappeared instantly. Lauren threw up her hands. "What story?" she asked. "Why will you not just explain it?" Margaret's eyes drifted briefly toward a hallway at the far side of the house. It was a small movement. Almost invisible. Yet it caught the attention of one relative sitting quietly near the kitchen entrance. The glance seemed deliberate. As though Margaret were waiting for something. Or someone. The thought passed quickly. Most people never noticed it. Lauren certainly did not. She had become increasingly focused on winning the argument. "You cannot just make a claim like this and expect everyone to believe you," she said. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "I am not asking anyone to believe me." The response puzzled everyone. If she was not asking for belief, then what was she waiting for? The room grew quiet again. Outside, darkness settled fully over the neighborhood. The lights inside the house reflected against the windows like mirrors. Within those reflections stood a woman completely alone against a room full of doubt. Yet despite the pressure surrounding her, Margaret Bennet looked less like someone trapped by a lie and more like someone patiently waiting for the truth to arrive. The longer the discussion continued, the more certain Lauren became that she was right. Certainty had a way of spreading through a room. One confident voice often attracted others, especially when the alternative seemed vague and incomplete. Margaret's refusal to explain herself was beginning to work against her. Family members who had remained neutral earlier were now quietly moving toward Lauren's side of the argument. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. A cousin standing near the kitchen island shook his head. I do not understand why this is even being debated, he said. Property records exist for a reason. Several relatives immediately agreed. Lauren nodded. Exactly. She walked toward a nearby side table and picked up a folder she had brought earlier that evening. The gesture instantly captured everyone's attention. I did not want to do this tonight, she said, opening the folder, but since we are apparently questioning reality, maybe this will help. Jason looked uncomfortable. He clearly did not enjoy seeing family matters become public discussion. Yet he made no attempt to stop her. Lauren removed several papers and held them up. These are copies of financial records connected to the property, she explained. For years, Jason has been handling payments, maintenance expenses, insurance coordination, and everything else related to this house. The documents appeared convincing. Family members leaned forward. Some stepped closer to examine them. The atmosphere changed immediately. People trusted paper. They trusted numbers. They trusted documents. Whether those documents told the entire story was another matter entirely. Lauren placed the records on the dining table. This is what evidence looks like, she said. The comment drew a few approving nods. Margaret remained silent. Her calmness seemed almost impossible to understand. Most people would have become defensive by now. Most people would have argued. Most people would have demanded to be heard. Margaret simply watched. Jason stepped forward. Mom, maybe we should just clear this up. His voice was gentle. If there is something we are missing, tell us. The request sounded reasonable. Several relatives waited expectantly. Once again, Margaret had an opportunity to explain everything. Once again, she declined. This is not the right moment, she said quietly. Frustration flashed across Lauren's face. Then when is the right moment? She asked. Because from where everyone is standing, it looks like you made a claim you cannot support. The words landed heavily. Around the room, people exchanged looks. More and more of them seemed willing to accept Lauren's version of events. It was easier. Cleaner. Simpler. Margaret's version required patience and unanswered questions. Lauren's version came with documents spread neatly across a table. An uncle adjusted his glasses and reviewed one of the pages. These records go back years, he observed. Another relative pointed toward a line item on one sheet. Everything seemed straightforward. Jason nodded slowly. Even he appeared reassured by what he saw. Margaret watched him carefully. There was sadness in her eyes, but not surprise. It was as though she had expected this exact reaction from the beginning. Across the room, Lauren sensed momentum building in her favor. Nobody is trying to embarrass you, she said. We just want honesty. The statement caused several people to nod again. Honesty. The word lingered in the room. Yet something about it felt incomplete. Margaret looked toward the folder on the table. Then she looked at Lauren. Those documents tell part of the story, she said. Lauren folded her arms. Then show us the rest. The challenge hung in the air. For the first time that evening, a trace of disappointment crossed Margaret's face. Not disappointment in Lauren. Not even disappointment in Jason. Disappointment that everyone seemed so eager to reach a conclusion before hearing everything. Outside, a cool breeze moved through the trees surrounding the property. Inside, the room felt increasingly confined. The evidence on the table appeared overwhelming. The opinions in the room appeared settled. And yet Margaret Bennett stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who knew a critical piece of the puzzle had not arrived yet. The room seemed to shrink with every passing minute. The documents Lauren had placed on the table remained at the center of attention, surrounded by relatives who viewed them as the final word on the matter. Margaret Bennett stood alone near the fireplace while conversations continued around her. Nobody was openly hostile. Nobody was shouting. Yet the collective doubt in the room felt heavier than anger. It was the kind of pressure created when nearly everyone had already decided what to believe. Lauren sensed it. The confidence in her posture grew stronger. She no longer looked like someone defending a position. She looked like someone presenting a conclusion. "I think we all know what is happening here," she said. Several family members nodded. Jason remained quieter than before, but even he seemed increasingly persuaded by the evidence on the table. The financial records appeared clear. The maintenance records appeared clear. Everything seemed to point in one direction. Margaret watched them carefully. What struck her most was not that people disagreed with her. It was how quickly they became comfortable with certainty. Few of them seemed interested in asking questions anymore. They wanted resolution. They wanted a simple answer. Lauren was giving them one. A relative seated near the dining room looked toward Margaret. "Why do you seem so calm?" he asked. The question surprised everyone. It was not the question they expected. Margaret looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because being doubted does not change the truth." The response created another silence. Lauren immediately folded her arms. "That sounds nice," she said, "but it is not evidence." Margaret nodded. "You are right." The answer caught Lauren off guard. She had expected resistance. Instead, she received agreement. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then it disappeared. "Then show evidence," Lauren replied. "If you have it." Again, the room waited. Again, Margaret declined. "Not yet." Frustration spread visibly through several family members. An uncle shook his head. A cousin sighed. To them, Margaret's behavior no longer appeared mysterious. It appeared unreasonable. Jason finally stepped away from the window and approached his mother. His voice remained respectful, but disappointment had entered it. "Mom, I am trying to understand," he said. "But every time someone asks a question, you say there is more to the story and then refuse to explain." Margaret looked at her son. There was sadness in her eyes, but also patience. "I know how this looks," she said quietly. "Then help me understand." Jason's words carried genuine emotion. For the first time that evening, Margaret seemed tempted to say more. Her gaze drifted toward the front entrance of the house. The movement lasted only a second, but Jason noticed it. So did Lauren. "Are you waiting for someone?" Lauren asked suddenly. The question changed the atmosphere immediately. Several relatives turned toward Margaret. She hesitated. It was the first hesitation anyone had seen from her all night. "Maybe," she answered. Lauren laughed softly. "Of course." The response drew a few uneasy smiles. To many people, it sounded like another attempt to avoid the issue. Yet something about Margaret's answer felt different. Genuine. Almost reassuring. Jason noticed it. An older relative noticed it too. The longer they watched her, the less she resembled someone inventing a story. There was no panic in her. No desperation. No sign of a person trapped by a false claim. Instead, she looked like someone waiting for a train she already knew was coming. That detail began to bother Jason. If she was wrong, why did she seem so confident? If she was confused, why did she never contradict herself? Across the room, Lauren continued speaking with relatives, reinforcing her position. The conversation drifted back toward records and responsibilities. Yet beneath it all, a subtle shift had begun. Tiny questions were forming. Tiny doubts were emerging. Not enough to change anyone's mind. Not yet. But enough to make the room feel different. Then, as the discussion continued and evening settled deeper outside the windows, a distant sound echoed from somewhere beyond the front door. Margaret heard it first. And for the first time all evening, the calm expression on her face was joined by the faintest hint of relief. The faint sound from beyond the front door faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving everyone uncertain whether they had truly heard it. Whatever it was, the conversation inside the house continued. Lauren seemed determined not to lose control of the evening. The brief hesitation that had crossed her face moments earlier disappeared as she returned her attention to the documents spread across the dining table. "I think we have spent enough time chasing mysteries," she said. "The facts are right here." Several relatives nodded. The folder remained open beneath the warm lights overhead, its pages displayed like the final chapter of a story everyone believed had already been written. Jason stood beside the table looking tired. He wanted the tension to end. More than anything, he wanted his family to stop arguing. Yet every attempt to move forward seemed to pull them deeper into the conflict. Margaret remained near the fireplace, calm but increasingly isolated. The room had slowly turned into a place where every glance carried judgment. Nobody openly called her dishonest, yet the implication hung in the air. Lauren took a step forward. "Margaret, this can end right now." The use of her first name instead of Mom did not go unnoticed. Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Lauren continued. "All you have to do is admit there was a misunderstanding." The room grew quiet. Everyone waited. Jason looked toward his mother with a mixture of hope and concern. An uncle folded his arms. A cousin leaned against the kitchen counter. The entire gathering seemed to pause for her response. Margaret looked around the room. She recognized every face. These were people who had celebrated birthdays with her, shared holiday dinners with her, and spent years walking through the front door of this house. Yet in that moment, she had never felt more alone. "There was no misunderstanding," she said softly. Lauren exhaled sharply and shook her head. "Then I do not know what else to say." The disappointment in her voice sounded genuine. That made the situation even more painful. To many people in the room, Lauren appeared reasonable while Margaret appeared stubborn. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. Jason lowered his eyes. "Mom, please." The words carried more sadness than frustration. Margaret looked at him. For a moment, memory surfaced. She remembered long nights working extra hours after her husband passed away years earlier. She remembered making sacrifices so Jason could attend a better school district. She remembered choosing this house because she believed it would give her family stability for generations. None of those memories existed in the documents on the table. None of them appeared in the conversations filling the room. Yet they lived within every corner of the house surrounding them. Lauren gestured toward the records again. "This is evidence," she said. "Everything points to the same conclusion." Margaret listened quietly. Then she looked at the folder for several seconds before speaking. "Sometimes evidence is incomplete." Lauren immediately responded. "Not this incomplete." A few nervous laughs followed. The reaction stung more than anyone realized. Margaret's eyes drifted across the room. She saw doubt everywhere. She saw impatience. She saw people who wanted certainty more than truth. Yet despite everything, she never appeared defeated. That detail continued to bother Jason. If she truly had no answer, why did she seem so unshaken? The question lingered in his mind. Then, just as Lauren prepared to continue, a sharp sound echoed through the house. This time everyone heard it clearly. The front doorbell. Conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned toward the entryway. The timing felt almost unreal. Margaret closed her eyes briefly and released a slow breath. Relief washed across her face so naturally that it could not be hidden. Jason noticed it. Lauren noticed it. So did everyone else. And as the silence settled over the room once again, all attention shifted toward the front door where an unexpected visitor had just arrived. For several seconds, nobody moved. The doorbell seemed to echo through the house long after the sound itself had faded. Every face turned toward the front entrance. Lauren stood frozen beside the dining table. Jason looked from the door to his mother and back again. The timing felt too precise to ignore. Margaret remained near the fireplace, her posture unchanged, but the relief that had appeared on her face moments earlier was impossible to miss. It was the first genuine sign of emotion she had shown all evening. That detail unsettled everyone. Jason noticed it immediately. If his mother had truly been bluffing, she would have looked nervous. Instead, she looked reassured. Lauren folded her arms. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "Yes." The answer landed heavily in the room. Several relatives exchanged looks. Suddenly, every strange response Margaret had given throughout the evening felt different. Every refusal to explain. Every insistence that part of the story was missing. Every confident statement despite overwhelming doubt. Jason felt a knot form in his stomach. He did not know why, but for the first time all night, he was no longer certain about anything. Another ring of the doorbell broke the silence. This time it sounded almost impatient. A relative near the hallway finally spoke. "Well, somebody should answer it." Nobody volunteered. The tension had become too thick. Finally Jason stepped forward. His footsteps echoed softly across the hardwood floor as he crossed the living room. Everyone watched him. Lauren remained near the table. Margaret never took her eyes off the front door. Jason reached the entrance and rested his hand on the handle for a brief moment. Then he opened it. Standing on the porch was a middle-aged man in a dark business jacket carrying a leather document case. He appeared professional, composed, and slightly confused by the number of people visible inside the house. "Good evening," the man said. "I am looking for Margaret Bennett." Jason blinked. "Who are you?" The man offered a polite smile. "Michael Foster." He adjusted the case in his hand. "I am a real estate broker." The words instantly changed the atmosphere inside the house. Several relatives who could hear the conversation turned toward one another. Lauren's confident expression faltered. Only slightly, but enough for Jason to notice. Michael glanced past him into the crowded room. "Margaret asked me to stop by this evening regarding a property file." Property file. The phrase seemed to pull all the air from the room. Jason stepped aside slowly. "Please come in." Michael entered the house and immediately sensed the tension surrounding him. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the gathered family members, the documents spread across the table, and the expressions of concern on nearly every face. Then he spotted Margaret. "Mrs. Bennett," he said warmly. "I apologize for being a few minutes late." Margaret smiled for the first time all evening. "You arrived exactly when you needed to." Nobody missed the significance of that statement. Michael looked around the room. "Did I interrupt something?" No one answered immediately. Lauren stared at the leather case in his hand. Jason stared at his mother. A growing feeling of uncertainty spread through the house. The assumptions that had seemed so solid an hour earlier no longer felt secure. Michael sensed it. He looked back at Margaret. "I brought the original file you requested." He lifted the case slightly, including the ownership records and transaction history. The room became completely silent. Even relatives standing at the far side of the house stopped moving. Every eye settled on the case. Lauren's confidence continued to fade. Jason felt his heartbeat quicken. Margaret simply nodded. The waiting was over. Whatever secret had remained hidden behind her calm expression throughout the evening was now standing in the middle of the living room carrying a leather case and a stack of records. And for the first time since the argument began, the room no longer belonged to assumptions. It belonged to the truth. Michael Foster placed the leather case on the dining table and carefully opened the brass clasps. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silent room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every eye followed his hands as he removed several folders, a property file, and a thick stack of official documents. Lauren stood motionless across the table. Jason remained near the front entrance, still trying to process what was happening. Margaret stayed exactly where she had been all evening, calm and patient, as though she had already lived through this moment 100 times in her mind. Michael adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. I was not aware this was a family gathering, he said politely. Mrs. Bennet simply requested that I bring the original ownership records. The word ownership immediately tightened the atmosphere. Lauren crossed her arms. Ownership records for what? Michael looked surprised by the question. For this property. He gently opened the first folder and removed a document protected inside a clear sleeve. The Bennet residence. Jason stepped closer. Several relatives gathered around the table. Michael placed the document where everyone could see it. This is the recorded property deed. The room fell silent again. Michael pointed to several sections of the page. His voice remained professional and neutral. He was not taking sides. He was simply explaining facts. The property was purchased 23 years ago. He traced a line with his finger. The legal purchaser and registered owner listed here is Margaret Bennet. Nobody spoke. Lauren stared at the document. Jason leaned forward. Michael continued. The deed has remained under the same ownership since the original purchase. He turned another page. There has never been a transfer of ownership to Jason Bennet. The words landed like a shockwave. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. One cousin immediately leaned closer to examine the paperwork. An uncle adjusted his glasses and read the name twice. Then a third time. Lauren shook her head. That cannot be right. Michael looked at her politely. These are county records. He opened another folder. I also brought the transaction history, tax records, and title documentation. He laid the papers across the table. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Every date matched. Every record aligned. Margaret Bennet was the legal owner. Not years ago. Not temporarily. Now. Jason felt as though the room had tilted beneath him. Wait, he said quietly. I have been handling repairs and payments. Michael nodded. Yes. Mrs. Bennet informed me that you helped manage various property expenses over the years. Jason looked confused. Then why would I do that if I did not own the house? Margaret finally spoke. Because I trusted you. The answer hit harder than anyone expected. Michael opened one final folder. There is actually a note regarding that arrangement. He removed a signed document. Mrs. Bennet authorized her son to assist with maintenance, scheduling, contractor coordination, and related responsibilities. However, ownership remained unchanged. Lauren's confidence disappeared completely. The financial records she had displayed earlier suddenly seemed much smaller. They proved involvement. They proved responsibility. They never proved ownership. Michael glanced around the room. I am sorry if there was confusion, but from a legal standpoint there is no uncertainty here. He tapped the property deed gently. Mrs. Bennet owns this home. Nobody laughed now. Nobody challenged Margaret. Nobody questioned her memory. The room that had spent hours doubting her was now staring directly at evidence stronger than any assumption. Jason looked toward his mother. His face reflected disbelief, regret, and embarrassment all at once. Margaret met his gaze without anger. Without triumph. Without satisfaction. She simply looked tired. For hours she had been asked to defend herself. For hours she had been treated as though she were mistaken. Yet the truth had never changed. It had only waited for someone to bring the right folder into the room. And now, as silence settled over the gathering once more, everyone realized the same thing. The woman they had doubted had been telling the truth from the very beginning. For several moments, nobody seemed capable of speaking. The documents remained spread across the dining table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally formed a complete picture. The difference was that the picture looked nothing like the one everyone had imagined. Michael Foster stood quietly beside the table, his role finished. He had not defended anyone. He had not accused anyone. He had simply presented records. Yet those records had changed the entire evening. Lauren stared at the property deed as though it might somehow transform into something else if she looked long enough. It did not. The name remained exactly where it had always been. Margaret Bennett. Jason felt a heaviness settle over him. Earlier that evening, he had believed he was helping resolve a misunderstanding. Now he realized he had spent hours doubting his own mother while standing inside a home she legally owned. The realization was difficult to escape. Around the room, relatives who had confidently supported Lauren's position now avoided eye contact. Some looked at the floor. Others studied the documents. A few simply sat in silence, reflecting on how quickly they had accepted assumptions as facts. Michael carefully organized several papers into neat stacks. "Everything is properly recorded through the county," he said. "There has never been any dispute in the official records." The statement only reinforced what everyone already knew. There was no hidden loophole. No missing page. No technicality waiting to appear. The truth was straightforward. The problem had never been the records. The problem had been belief. Jason slowly approached the table and picked up one of the documents. He read it again. Then a third time. Every line led to the same conclusion. Finally he looked toward his mother. She had not moved. She remained near the fireplace where she had stood for most of the evening. The difference was that she no longer looked isolated. The room had shifted around her. Earlier she had been surrounded by doubt. Now she was surrounded by silence. Jason took a slow breath. "Mom," he said softly. The single word carried more emotion than anything else he had said all night. Margaret looked at him. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction. No desire to remind him that she had been right. That absence of bitterness made the moment even more painful. Jason lowered his eyes. "I should have listened." Nobody interrupted. The room seemed to understand that this conversation belonged to them. Margaret smiled faintly. "You were trying to make sense of what you thought you knew." Jason shook his head. "I still should have listened." Nearby, one relative quietly apologized. Then another. The reaction spread naturally through the room. Nobody had intended to hurt Margaret. Yet intentions did not erase consequences. Several people admitted they had reached conclusions too quickly. Others acknowledged that they never asked enough questions. Lauren remained silent longer than anyone else. Her confidence from earlier in the evening had disappeared completely. She glanced toward the documents and then toward Margaret. The contrast between those two images seemed impossible to ignore. Facts on the table. Assumptions and memory. Eventually Lauren spoke. Her voice was quieter than before. "I thought I understood the situation." Margaret nodded gently. "I know." The response surprised everyone. It contained neither accusation nor triumph. Just understanding. Michael closed the final folder and prepared to leave. His work was complete. Yet before he departed, he looked around the room one last time. "It is interesting," he said thoughtfully. "Most property disputes begin because people disagree with documents. Tonight everyone believed the documents they already had and ignored the possibility that there might be more. Nobody argued with him. They could not. The evening had become a lesson none of them expected. As the warm lights continued to glow above the gathering and the documents rested quietly on the table, the certainty that had dominated the room for hours finally disappeared. In its place came something far more uncomfortable and far more valuable. Humility. The atmosphere inside the house no longer resembled the gathering that had begun earlier that evening. The tension was gone. The arguments were gone. Even the certainty that had driven the conflict seemed to have vanished. In its place remained reflection. Michael Foster gathered the final documents and carefully returned them to his leather case. Before leaving, he shook Margaret Bennett's hand and offered a respectful smile. "Thank you for trusting me with the records," he said. Margaret nodded. "Thank you for bringing them. With that, he quietly made his way toward the front door. Nobody stopped him. His role in the evening had been simple. He arrived with facts. The facts spoke for themselves. After the door closed behind him, silence settled over the room once more. Yet this silence felt completely different from the one that came before. Earlier it had been filled with doubt. Now it carried understanding. Jason remained standing near the dining table. The property deed was still in his hands. He looked around the room and suddenly noticed something he had overlooked for years. Family photographs lined the walls. Holiday memories filled shelves and cabinets. Every room carried traces of sacrifices he had never fully appreciated. His mother had built this life piece by piece. Not for recognition. Not for praise. Simply because she loved her family. The realization stayed with him. Slowly, he walked across the room toward Margaret. This time there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. When he reached her, he stopped and looked directly into her eyes. "I am sorry," he said. The words were simple. Honest. Real. Margaret studied her son for a moment before smiling gently. "I know." Tears gathered in Jason's eyes. Not because of the property. Not because of the documents. Because he realized how close he had come to allowing assumptions to damage something far more valuable than a house. Trust. Nearby, Lauren stood quietly. The confidence she displayed earlier felt like a distant memory. Eventually she stepped forward as well. "Margaret," she said softly. "I owe you an apology." The room grew still. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law. Lauren took a slow breath. "I thought I had all the answers. I thought I understood everything. I was wrong." Nobody interrupted. The words needed no explanation. Margaret nodded. "We all make mistakes." Again, there was no bitterness in her voice. No desire to make anyone feel worse. The absence of resentment seemed to affect the room more deeply than anger ever could have. One by one, relatives began speaking. Some apologized. Others admitted they should have asked more questions. A few confessed that they followed the crowd instead of thinking for themselves. The evening had revealed more than property ownership. It had revealed how easily people confuse confidence with truth. Margaret listened patiently. Then she glanced around the room that had become so important to the discussion. The house stood exactly as it had at the beginning of the evening. The walls had not changed. The records had not changed. The truth had not changed. Only people's understanding of it had changed. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. "A house can be measured in square feet. It can be valued with documents. It can be recorded in county records." She paused briefly. "But trust is different. Once people stop listening, they can lose sight of what is right in front of them." Nobody looked away. The lesson felt larger than the property itself. It reached beyond ownership. Beyond paperwork. Beyond the argument that had consumed the evening. Jason lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Lauren stood quietly beside him. Around them, family members reflected on the same truth. Margaret smiled softly and looked around the home she had protected for so many years. Then she delivered the final words that would remain with everyone long after the night ended. The truth does not become a lie simply because a room full of people refuses to believe it. No one responded. No one needed to. Because as the warm lights filled the house and the evening finally came to an end, everyone understood that some truths do not need defending forever. They simply wait for the right moment to be seen.